So in my last video I started talking about the structure of your thesis, writing your thesis, and I said I was going to look at various different parts of the thesis, remembering that in many meanings thesis and argument are the same thing. A thesis puts forward a claim. The thesis is the thing that is driving you forwards, and it's got to be supported by evidence. So what I'm going to look at today is the literature review. And I said before that in normal structure, chapter 2 of a thesis is said to be a literature review, but that doesn't tell you what the literature review is there to do. So what I want to think about is the tasks that have to be done with the literature review. Why do we look to the literature? What is it that the literature is trying to tell us? And because we're putting forward a thesis, making a claim, it's like trying to make a case in court. And before we get to the court, before the jury is sworn in, before anyone can look at any of the evidence, the lawyers get together and they discuss how the case is going to be presented. And the lawyer for the prosecution might say, well, the accused was outside the pub and got involved in a fight. And the defence lawyer will say, well, my client admits that he was outside the pub, but he denies that he got into the fight. Or he admits that he got into the fight, but he denies that he instigated or started the fight. So that the evidence, the first job of the lawyers in looking at the case is to say, well, he's agreed that he was there. There's no need to discuss that. We don't need to bring witnesses to prove that he was standing in the place where the fight took place. We've got the agreement of what was known beforehand, things that we don't have to discuss. And that's the first job of the literature review, is to set the scene, to say these things are known and these things do not need to be discussed. I don't need to provide evidence for the fact that there are education systems in different countries. That's taken for granted. The things that the literature review can do is to establish certain things are known and certain things are taken as the basis before we start any original research of our own. So the first task of the literature review is to establish what's not going to be discussed. Not that they're not going to be discussed, but they don't need discussing because they're generally understood to be true. So that's the first job of the literature review. It's that clearing of the ground before you start your research project. Perhaps you might call it background or context, but that's the first job that it's there to do. The second thing to do is to establish where you're going to put your point of leverage, where you're going to begin your research study. Now, many people will say you're looking for the gap in the research. You're looking for the research gap. You're looking for the gap that your knowledge is going to fill. I don't like that expression at all. I think that gaps do not just lay around. I think that you have to show why there is something that needs to be decided. You need to be looking for a debate in the literature. You need to be looking for something that someone else has done and a problem that they've left unresolved. And they may not say, by the way, here's a problem that hasn't been resolved and you could do it next. As you often see in the ending of dissertations, opportunities for new research. Opportunities are not like that. You have to go and look and say, well, he thought he'd resolved all the issues. He thought he'd resolved all the problems, and he didn't. Here's the thing he didn't look at. Here's the thing he ignored. Here's the thing he missed. And in that tiny little gap, you're going to insert your research. It's not originally a gap, you have to make it. You're making the space. You're showing what it was that needs to be explained, perhaps with the things that were originally thought to be agreed in somebody else's research. There's a gap there that's been overlooked. So the second thing is to outline what question you're addressing, the debate that you're addressing, the question, where your research questions come from. You know that you're going to formally state your research questions later, but what questions arise from the literature and where do they fit with the literature? So what's been missed by the literature that you've read that you think needs to be examined? Now, if you're lucky, you will also be able to find somebody who's looked at it from a similar enough perspective to give you a theory, to give you a framework within which to do your analysis, a way of looking at this problem that you're tackling, that question you're trying to answer, and you'll have a theory that you can choose from a book, perhaps a classic book going back decades, perhaps it's more recent, but you're looking for somebody who's established and set out a theory that you can use, that you can, it might be in education, it might be a psychological theory, it might be a sociological theory, it might be a theory of management, it might be any one of a range of possible frameworks for analysing it. And this is a different kind of piece of literature. It sets the theory. And obviously, the theory that you will use, that feeds into your section on methodology and how you will do the analysis. All of those questions that are going to come up through the course of the thesis. And if we're lucky and we get to the successful end of your research project, then you'll be asked to make a claim, invited to make a claim. What is it that's original about what you've done? What's new that what you've done? And you cannot know that something you've done is original unless you've looked at what's been done before, which means that the claim to be original rests upon you knowing what's been done before. So there's a number of jobs that the literature review has to do. At the beginning of your study, it has to set out the things that are already agreed, already established. At the beginning of your study, it has to show what's been missed previously, where you can fit in, what debates you're going to come to provide an answer to, and also early on, not right at the very beginning, but once you've settled what your problem is, what your issue is that you're approaching, it'll then help you select the theory that you're going to use. And at the end of your research, you'll come back to the literature and you will make a claim to originality, and that also will need to be based upon the literature. Now, because the jobs that this literature has to do are threaded through your thesis, that's why I say to you, the literature review as a separate chapter is not necessarily the be-all and end-all of what you need from the literature. You need something that does different jobs at different points in your thesis. So your engagement with the literature has to run through the whole thesis. Sure, you can do the literature review to establish the things beforehand, to establish the case of what debates you want to get engaged in, but it's not just a question of I've read this book, I've read that book, this person says this, that person says the other thing. You're critically reviewing the literature. So here are some things that people claim they've established. Do you believe it or don't you? Do you evaluate those claims or not? And how do they fit together? what's been missed? Why do you think it's been missed? Why do you think that you can see something's been missed when other people haven't seen what's been missed, or have other people already pointed to those things that have been missed? You're critically using the literature to build up your case, to build up your argument. And so it's not just a literature review in a kind of passive sense. Here's the literature and I'm going to tell you about the literature. The theory that you'll be using, again, it's a question of engaging with that theory. This is probably the central issue in the literature review. You're addressing a book, a text that sets the theoretical framework. And no point in just telling me you're going to base this on the theory of this person, or you're going to use the framework of that person. You need to explain what it means and how you're going to use it and how you interpret it. You and I might read the same book. We might read a book by Vygotsky or by a sociologist, the sociological imagination, find a book on capability approaches, whatever it is. The few words that I put there don't explain how I interpret the theory. You need to be saying how you interpret the theory, which bits you're using, which bits you're ignoring. Don't point me just at a book. Tell me which parts are important to you and why they're important and why you've chosen them. And finally, the claim to originality. You'll come back at the end of your piece of research, at the end of your dissertation, at the end of your thesis, having made your claim, you'll come back to the literature. Having grounded your study in the literature, you'll be able to come back to the literature and say, I'm adding this. This has not been done before. This is a new aspect. Might be new data. I've applied the theory, that an established theory has been applied in an area where it's never been applied before. Or the theory didn't quite work out the way I hoped it was going to. I had to make modifications to it, and this is why I've made those modifications. Or I've seen things in a different light. I've taken a theory from one area, applied it into a different area, and it gives me an insight that no one has ever had before. So 3 kinds of originality, and you can claim one of them, new data, new theory, or new interpretation, and those things will take you back to the literature and give you a conclusion that will round off your dissertation with possible recommendations, but that's not necessarily the case. You don't need, it's not absolutely essential that you have recommendations at the end of the thesis. Sometimes things are just more complicated than that. A dissertation, a thesis, a research project ends without giving a clear line of action, but does contribute to the discussion and the debate for future research. So these are the things that the literature review must do, and that's why I'm not so worried whether it all occurs in a single chapter. It needs spreading through the different parts of the thesis so that the thesis is pulled together coherently, and at the end, when you've got that difficult question of what have you contributed, it's not that difficult because you've set the scene for it early on by showing which bits of literature you're connecting to.